Welcome back to another installment of our history of music. Now, in the last episode, we left off somewhere around 50,000 years ago. Now, this is the time around which we see the first evidence for culturally modern humans. Humans, in other words, who were like us not only in physical appearance, but also whose behaviours and lifeways were in a sense no more different from ours than those of other groups of humans alive today. Just as we do, these humans talked and made music and sung. They painted and carved and strung beads together into necklaces. They were inextricably linked to the physical world of which they were a part, and at the same time they inhabited a world of ideas, of spirit, of symbols, of intangible forces that influenced their lives. In other words, they were people who found themselves in that quintessentially human position, suspended somewhere between the physical world of matter, that is the world that we encounter through the senses, and on the other hand, the abstract, the world that we encounter through the mind. Although, if there is one way in which maybe they would have been quite different from us, it is precisely in the fact that we perceive a strong difference between these two, what is often called the mind-body dualism, where they most likely did not, definitely not in the way that we do. We see this in aspects of the lives of hunter-gatherers still living today, where spirit is not understood in the abstract Platonic way that contemporary Westerners do. It is not supernatural. It is very natural. In a sense, it is life, that life which is in all things, in the sun, the stars, the sky, the rivers, the trees, the mountains, the animals, and of course, within each of them too. Now, before we get into discussions about music, I would like to first take a little journey into hunter-gatherer culture in general, and also to consider for a moment the way in which we often perceive these other cultures. As contemporary Westerners, when we encounter these animistic ideas about the whole world being alive, almost like some kind of superorganism, of a life force that infuses all aspects of the cosmos, we do find these ideas at times inspiring and even poetic. But we generally don't take them seriously. We see them as quaint and superstitious or outdated. And we can tell ourselves that we know that our conception of reality must be so much more true because our calculations and our technology and our scientific formulas are so much more precise. What is the often repeated mantra about science? That it works. And so, if the calculations work, then that must mean that the stories or theories that we tell about these formulas must also be true. But a quick glance at history shows empirically that these two don't go hand in hand. Newton's formulas, for example, in mathematics and physics, work, and they work incredibly well. Now, there is some approximation going on, but they're still very much used even today in all kinds of applications. They're a truly stunning intellectual achievement. But no scientist living today would share Newton's interpretation of what these results meant, or his worldview. For Newton, the fact that the cosmos appeared to obey rational mathematical laws was a demonstration that the world was governed by a mysterious reason, that the universe was an emanation of the divine mind and the immutable, eternal laws of physics, those invisible, intangible forms that could not be seen, tasted, or touched, but were observable in every aspect of the world. Those were like ideas in the mind of God, aspects of the divine. He was inspired in this by his deeply mystical understanding of Christian theology, of Renaissance magic, of Hermetic philosophy, and of Neoplatonism. He believed that the principle of the cosmos was reason. He believed in the ancient Hermetic idea of macrocosm and microcosm, expressed in the saying, "as above, so below." In other words, the idea that the forms and the laws of the universe are uniform across all scales, from the cosmic to the human to the microscopic. And most profoundly, permeating many of the ideas was a conception of a universal attractor, a force which permeates the entire cosmos and attracts all things to all other things, which is also another very ancient and mystical idea that he absorbed from his study of sympathetic magics. And incidentally, you can see that this idea of a force that flows through the entire cosmos and draws all matter to all other matter is actually quite an animistic idea. Now, all of these ideas, which were swimming through his mind, were the eyes with which Newton saw the world. And in fact, without these ideas, he wouldn't have produced the work that he did. Newton's greatest achievement, in a sense, was a staggering leap of creativity, of the imagination. And no, you don't get any points for guessing which of his great ideas was influenced by the conception of a universal attractor. The thing with worldviews is that they aren't so much true or untrue, they are the way in which we imagine the world, and without imagining it, we cannot know it or see it, because all that you know and see is necessarily, in a sense, a manifestation of the mind. So they're more like stories, or even better, metaphors, through which we are able to understand that which is in a fundamental way too much for us to wrap our minds around: the entire universe. To a modern secular scientist, Newton's mystical Christianity is as untrue as the polytheism of the Greeks and the Romans. It's not as if a modern scientist would look at Newton's Christian beliefs and say, well, these are closer to what we believe is true than the polytheism of the Greeks and Romans. No, they're equally false in their understanding. And in 500 years, our materialist, or the better term is physicalist, conception of reality will likely seem equally untrue, replaced by something radically different, and our scientists might seem as strange as the medieval theologians intent on trying to understand reality by attempting to deduce the mind of God. So I hope that you take from this that this is not a jab at scientists at all. They have undeniably produced work of the highest order. The point, if anything, is that you find that so too did those great medieval theologians, for example, when you actually go and read them. They were simply operating within a different framework, and there is much to learn from their ideas as there is from the great ideas of all cultures. So we fit the entire universe into our small brains by turning it into a story, and the stories that we tell are necessarily, in one sense, false, because they are not made of the things of the world itself, but of abstractions and ideas. And ideas are born of the human imagination. In what way does your idea of a flower resemble an actual flower? Well, about as much as the word flower resembles a flower. You can't pick the idea of flower. It does not smell. It does not bloom. So to ask if a worldview is true or not is a bit like asking whether it is true that the word flower really means flower. Well, for those who live within a certain cultural space, it does, and crucially, for them, it works. Ultimately, the differences in our understanding of the world vis-à-vis the world that our hunter-gatherer ancestors inhabited comes down to the fact that the patterns of our lives and our lived experiences are so radically different that our worldviews necessarily need to be equally different. For them, their worldview worked in a way that we cannot really imagine to fully understand. If we judge our ancient ancestors, or even modern hunter-gatherers, based on what is important to us, then we will never learn anything that we don't already know. Imagine taking a human who lived a few tens of thousands of years ago and trying to gauge their intelligence by sitting them down in front of a modern IQ test. How much could that tell you about how intelligent this individual is? These were humans who couldn't read or write, but they could read landscapes. And how many of us can do that? Modern astronomers perform incredibly sophisticated work and spend a lot of time looking at mind-bendingly precise readings of electromagnetic spectrums. And through this work, they have made all kinds of astonishing leaps. But, as many of them are often happy to admit, when they look up at the night sky, they can only pick out a handful of constellations. Many hunter-gatherers know every detail of the night sky, and they can see in it a map that they can use to navigate vast landscapes. Or they can tell stories from memory of those who inhabit the sky that would take many nights to tell. We cannot imagine to know what it means to see and hear and smell the world through the eyes of a hunter-gatherer. And if any one of us were suddenly dropped into the world of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, how long would we survive? We would be as ludicrously unprepared for their world as they would appear in ours. In a world that does not have the infrastructures that give our lives such predictability and stability, you have to think very fast on your feet. Opportunities and threats can present themselves at a moment's notice, and the window of opportunity may be incredibly brief. You have to improvise, and you really have to be able to look after yourself. If we suddenly had no grocery stores or tap water, would we even know where or how to find drinking water? And our senses would be so much slower and duller than those of those ancient humans. When we put this all together, it's not hard to imagine that any one of us would appear not only as incredibly unintelligent in their world, but even as severely handicapped. The world that the hunter-gatherers saw, and for the few who remain, still see today, is so different from ours. They knew that they were part of something larger than themselves. As we said in the last episode, these ancient humans were a shifting, moving part of the natural landscape. They followed the migrating herds which sustained them, and the herds followed the pastures and the changing seasons, and they had all been doing this for longer than anyone could remember. Further back than the collective memory of their stories could recall, those unseen forces that moved the living landscape, that shaped their very existence and granted them life, those forces had been there. They would have observed the repeating cycle of the seasons with much greater keenness than we do, the yearly death and rebirth of the world. And they would also have noticed that the death of one animal was not the end of life, but that rather out of the death of one came the life of others. Time, if it had a direction, was a circle. The smallest unit of survival was the familial group. Individuals who got cut off from the group, whether by accident or intentionally, would likely not survive very long. Just as they were deeply connected to the natural landscape, so too they were connected to each other. And for the greater part of human history, this is how humans have lived. In small bands, living in the world, moving and shifting with it. And in a few remote pockets of the world, a handful still do, and others did until very recently. In some cases, still treading paths walked by their ancestors, telling stories and singing songs that are held in ancient collective memories. These few surviving hunter-gatherers are the focus of what we will be looking at today. And when, in the next episode, we will return to our historical timeline and look at the evidence for musical behaviours in the last few tens of thousands of years, we will be using what we have learned today to inform our understanding of some of those remains. However, the first thing to get out of the way straight away is that the hunter-gatherer populations that survived into the modern era should not be thought of as prehistoric populations frozen in time and preserved to the modern day. Their cultures are the result of continued change and development like all societies, but they are ones for whom hunting and gathering continues to be the most effective or the preferred method of subsistence. So although we cannot make any one-to-one correspondences between contemporary hunter-gatherers and those prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, they can still inform, to an extent, our understanding of prehistoric human cultures, or, in our case, of their musical practices. As Iain Morley puts it in his book, The Prehistory of Music, first, and more generally, they can help us to realize that the musical traditions of Western culture only represent a very small portion of musicking throughout human history. And encountering the musical practices of hunter-gatherer societies opens us up to a much vaster landscape of musicking that has more in common with traditional musical practices than our contemporary Western music does. And second, the musicking traditions we encounter are the product of societies on whom the same kinds of constraints operate as those that were experienced by prehistoric hunter-gatherers, both in terms of resources available to them and in their technological affordances. And so they can give us some general impressions of what kinds of remains we might expect to find when excavating prehistoric sites. Just as with our own culture, music is interwoven with all aspects of life in hunter-gatherer societies. In fact, we might say even more so, which makes it all the more surprising that in the work of anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, we find very little discussion of musics and their function when compared to other aspects of these societies. And this is an issue not just with anthropology, and not just with the study of hunter-gatherers. Music is, in the West at this point, seen as a very specialist subject, especially in terms of study and in academia, and so it is rarely treated by historians or anthropologists and other scholars. When you read a history book, for example, the author might tell you about all kinds of things: military history, political history, language, art history, the changing fashions, the development of ideas, but they will very rarely tell you anything about the musics of those peoples. And yet, musicking is a fundamental part of the life of all cultures. Now, we all know, almost to the point of cliché in fact, that studying the language of a culture is a key to understanding how those people think. But just as every culture has a language, and this language permeates all aspects of the life of that culture, so too do all peoples have musics. And just like language, the musics can give insights into virtually all aspects of that culture. And the things that it can tell us about are those things which are precisely beyond language, beyond words. Now, the first group of hunter-gatherers that we'll encounter are the Blackfoot, the Niitsitapi, who until recently roamed the central plains of North America. Now, curiously, the habitat that they lived in was in many ways quite similar to the grasslands occupied by ancestral hunter-gatherers in Africa many thousands of years ago, and their lifeways were reminiscent in other ways too. They would travel on foot, following the migrating herds of bison, and one of their preferred hunting techniques was a form of hunting that we believe has been practiced for more than 100,000 years by Paleolithic humans and Neanderthals. They would drive bison over a cliff edge and then harvest the meat from the bodies that had fallen. Blackfoot hunters would drive the herd through a rich repertoire of techniques used to harass and to tire the bison in order to reduce the risk to themselves. Humans with spears are simply not a match for bison in a direct confrontation. Now here's where it gets interesting. Evidence suggests that they learnt to stalk the bison by imitating the behaviour they observed in wolves. As Chantelle Marlor describes in a paper, she says, they performed wolves. They tried to look like wolves and to move like wolves. They became wolves in ceremonies at home in camp and in the presence of bison herds on the prairie. As you can imagine, the wearing of wolf hides held deep significance. Now this too is an astonishing example of the human imagination, thinking at a distance, the ability to imagine other worlds, a world in which you are the wolf, and then to enact that in your world. They even developed a close hunting relationship with the wolves. But they didn't just imitate. They also brought a number of distinctly human technologies to the mix. They would use weapons and fire, and they would harness the power of sound through vocalization and sound-producing tools. And even beyond this, sound, and in particular singing, was central to the enactment of this hunt/ritual. You see, the herd would initially be enticed towards the area where the drive would be performed by the singing of a young man. As Iain Morley describes it, a spiritually potent song in the manner of a bleating calf. A practice which is eerily reminiscent of reports of Kondoli Aborigines in southern Australia who would sing to whales, attracting them to the shore in the hopes that they might beach themselves. As you can see, when entering such a world, we need to put aside the cultural categories that we're used to. Instances such as this show how difficult it is to say what is and isn't music when talking about other cultures. Is the young man performing this hunting song really singing, or is he imitating animal calls? Personally, I would venture to say that one does certainly not exclude the other. Musicking is a very important part of the ceremonial life of the Blackfoot. Traditionally, during summer meetings, groups would join from across the plains to renew relationships, to trade and to resolve disputes. The performance of a sun dance was central to these ceremonies, inviting health and prosperity into their lives. And even though today, sadly, their lifeways are severely restricted by the reservation system, many practices, including musicking, are kept alive by the surviving members, and music and dance still play a central role in gatherings to this day. The music of the Plains Indians is largely monophonic, meaning that it consists of a single melody rather than multiple melodic lines in harmony. And the predominant instrument is the human voice, often accompanied by percussion. Music plays a similarly fundamental role in mediating the social interactions of the Yupik, hunter-gatherer populations indigenous to Alaska and the far east of Russia. Their total population is somewhere in the region of 30,000 individuals, living in groups of 100 or so spread across their traditional lands. Their music is also largely vocal, with drumming accompanying the singing of songs which are intended for dance. And you can see two fine examples of Yupik dancing masks on the cover of today's episode. Many of these dance songs revolve around stories of ancestral or contemporary heroes within the community, as well as remembering comic incidents that occurred in the lives of group members, and also the depiction of animal and bird life. The recounting of comic events has a strong bonding effect on the community, as does the singing of the histories that shape the identity of the community. And so the singers are often those individuals with the best stories. We live surrounded by an unending supply of storytelling in the form of mass media, And so it is difficult for us really to comprehend how significant the telling of stories is in such a context, and the special power wielded by those who can conjure images and even entire worlds into existence by the use of words. The melodies of these songs often consist of only 2 or 3 notes, and the narration of the singing is enhanced by the use of non-linguistic syllables, purely expressive sounds, expressive utterances, which are known as vocables. Another way that music plays a fundamental role in the communal life of the Yupik is the practice of so-called teasing songs. These are songs that function almost as a form of legal mechanism in resolving disputes, where the offended party is afforded the opportunity to compose and perform a song in the form of a put-down, which is designed to embarrass the perpetrator in front of the community, and so to set an example and hopefully prevent future occurrences of this offence. And this is also taken to settle the dispute between the two. And on hearing about this, a friend of mine one time said that this is how the diss track was born. And he was joking, but even though they're obviously quite different, it's not completely wrong to make a comparison between the teasing songs of the Yupik and dissing in rap music. Historically, musicking, like many other forms of display, has been used as a proxy for direct confrontation, so this is a very natural human behaviour. And for hunter-gatherers, with the vulnerability that comes with humans living in such small groups, the cohesion of the group is of primary importance. And so music has to have a profoundly communal role. It modulates the interactions of individuals by being embedded in the patterns of activity that regulate societal norms and behaviours. In a similar vein, among the Aka Pygmies of Central Africa, we see the Makala, a net-hunting Mabo dance song, which also functions as a system of diplomacy with neighbouring groups. The performers consist of a core group of seasoned musicians and dancers, and they encourage less practiced novices to take part and to learn the song and the moves while they head over to another village. And there they will also teach their music to their neighbours. And through this musical exchange, they develop and preserve those bonds between groups, which are often as crucial to the continuation of their lifeways as are the bonds within the group. In another equally fundamental role, music also functions as a form of record keeping, as a way of storing important knowledge. For hunter-gatherers such as the Yupik, who often journey through vast landscapes, travelling songs can provide something of an oral map. These songs tell of great journeys and adventures while providing very detailed environmental information about weather conditions and landscapes. There are also other kinds of songs that preserve similarly useful information. Berry-picking songs are usually performed by women and children as they travel picking berries which they store as a food supply for harsher times. Travelling songs and berry-picking songs among the Yupik function in a way that is not unlike that of the songs associated with Australian Aboriginal songlines. Lines in the land and sky that mark the journeys of creator beings during the Great Dreaming. Those who have knowledge of songlines and travelling songs and berry-picking songs are able to use these to navigate and to survive in vast landscapes by singing, retracing landscapes with their words as they retrace them with their steps. All these songs contain detailed descriptions of environmental features, including many that aid in locating and discovering food sources, such as berries in the case of the Yupik. This, after all, is a challenge faced by most communities of hunter-gatherers, knowing where to find edible plants, and knowing which plants you can eat and which you can't. Imagine for a moment that you are part of a small band of hunter-gatherers who has just moved into a new area. The plants and the animals are unfamiliar to you. How do you find out what you can eat? And how do you discover what is poisonous? Well, when it comes to the animals, that's usually fairly easy. Most things that move you can eat. But when it comes to plants, things get a lot trickier. So how did the hunter-gatherers manage it? In simple terms, through a process of gradual acculturation about the surrounding environment, through a process of trial and error, and of gradual accumulation of knowledge. So when we stop to consider how hard-won this knowledge of plants and of the surrounding environments must have been, it is very easy to understand why preserving it is of such importance. Now, an interesting byproduct of this process of exploring and experimenting with resources is that occasionally people have stumbled upon curious plants and fungi that, taken in careful quantities, induce peculiar states of altered consciousness. And these, in many cases, acquire great significance within the spiritual life of the communities that discover them, since they release mysterious forces that blur the boundaries between this and other worlds. Now, in Western culture, and especially in its intellectual culture, both religious and secular, the idea that consciousness-altering substances might be a genuine tool for the discovery and exploration of knowledge is very much frowned upon. Some people have called this the anti-psychedelic bias. What they're getting at with this is that they're pointing out that there is a particular way in which we view the pursuit of knowledge in the West that is in some ways an echo of Christian piety and theology, or at the very least it has deep parallels with it. In the Christian worldview, the truest form of knowledge is revelation. And how does one come by such a revelation? The theology is quite clear on this. To be the recipient of a revelation is a fundamentally passive act. You can perhaps strive to be worthy of receiving such revelation. You can pray, but ultimately God cannot be made to reveal himself. In fact, it would be a sin to even try. Religious practices that attempted to manipulate the divine came with time to be seen negatively as magic or witchcraft. God is that which is objectively true. And when some aspect of God is revealed to you, in its objectivity, it is impressed upon you. You are, in a sense, almost subjected to the revelation. Now translate this over to the post-Cartesian rationalist world of the 17th and 18th century, and the material world is that which is objectively true. And so again, in its objectivity, when we perceive it through the senses, the world is simply impressing itself upon us, as it is. This view sees observation as a purely passive act. Now, for those of you who are up to speed on current science, you'll know that this doesn't really fully sit that well, even with the contemporary scientific consensus. The idea that observation is a purely passive act does not sit that well with 20th and 21st century physics, and as far as perception, modern neuroscience posits that we essentially hallucinate the entire world in our brains each time we see it. And yet, most of us in the West do still think of observation and perception as purely passive rather than active or creative acts. And if you hold this view, then the idea that you might use something to actively stimulate intuition and imagination, and thus alter your quote-unquote normal perceptions, that you might explore the worlds of perception and of mind and through this gain some understanding, is seen at best as misguided, if not downright immoral. Now, other cultures do not necessarily share this view, and we see that among many hunter-gatherers, the idea of going outside of yourself and actively inducing communication with the intangible forces of other worlds is fundamental to their cultural practice of piety. And it is not just through the consumption of consciousness-altering substances that this is achieved. They recognize that many of the things that most profoundly alter our consciousness are intangible. Much, much more commonly, in fact, other unseen forces that have a profound effect on the psyche are employed. Sound and music. Intangible yet very present phenomena that function as a bridge between worlds. Now at this point, we want to be careful here to not go too far in one way and emphasize the differences so much that we turn our description of these practices into distorted caricatures of the other. So now that we have encountered these behaviors through a language that highlights their strangeness, let's try to make them a little more familiar. It may be true that in Western culture the search for knowledge through the use of intoxicating substances is something of a taboo. But it is also true that our history is full of traditions that try to achieve such effects through subtler means, and sometimes not so subtle. The Western tradition is filled with saints who mortified their flesh, who starved themselves and retreated to deserts or atop columns in order to find something that is obscured in the normal bustle of day-to-day life. And even today, anyone who cultivates any form of practice knows that it cannot be undertaken in just any mental state. We listen to music to alter our consciousness. Some people run or walk to facilitate the flow of ideas. Some seclude themselves away in contemplative silence. We change the body to change the mind. For me, this is especially apparent through a simple observation of my own methods. Long periods of silence, both outward and inward, are fundamental to making these episodes. The best that I can say is that without these, they would be very different. And again, if it seems surprising to us that singing is used as a form of record keeping, in truth this is only really something that is surprising to those of us who grew up within a literate society, where writing is commonplace and functions as our main means of memory storage. As we said in the episode on music language, and as we all know from experience, it is much easier to memorize the words of a song than it is to memorize a block of text of the same length. When we weave words into rhythms and rhymes, they become gestural patterns with their own form of muscle memory. And even up until recently, long after most humans had moved away from a hunting and gathering lifestyle, songs were still the repositories of collective and individual memories, as only a few were skilled in the arts of writing. The recent proliferation of literacy, though there are many good things that we might say about it, also silenced the singing in the hearts of peoples. And in fact, we have not completely forgotten the power of song and of vocalization as an aid to memory. All of us have used mnemonics of some kind, and we have used nursery rhymes and spoken acronyms, even as adults, to remind ourselves or to remember something. These always have a certain sort of rhythm or cadence or rhymes or alliteration of some sort going on when you say them out loud. And any time we have done this, we have done exactly what humans have been doing for thousands of years. That we can even remember, and often word for word, nursery rhymes from our school days shows how ingrained this form of memory is. And the fact that we often physically mouth or say the mnemonics under our breath highlights the role played by the gesture in this kind of pattern-based memory. And in fact, probably the most obvious way in which we still use these techniques is the way in which we relay information to children who haven't quite yet mastered the art of writing. Song singing plays a key role in the education of young children, and there are many reasons for this. It develops coordination and interaction, but most fundamentally, it is the most natural way of memorizing things. And so similarly, it shouldn't be a surprise that among hunter-gatherers we also see that song and dance play a fundamental role in the communal education of children. The Yupik have many kinds of songs that are either performed for or by children, often in the form of games which develop a variety of skills. Some of these, such as the juggling game songs, are performed in a variety of forms, all the way from Siberia, across Alaska, Canada, and even Greenland. The fact that they are so widely spread means that they likely share a common origin very far back in the past, making them a very ancient form of song. There are also animal identification songs that adults sing to children, teaching them how to recognize and distinguish different kinds of birds and fish. In these songs, just as we saw among the indigenous Australians and the Plains Indians, the Yupik often imitate the sounds and the behaviors of animals that are a part of their world. One of the most fascinating songs sung by Yupik children are ghost game songs. These take the form of a question and answer game in which the answers are improvised on the spot. These often relay information about the intentions or the whereabouts of the spirit. This is a game of coordination and interaction and physical activity. The children must be spontaneously creative with their answers. And when a child is unable to come up with an answer to the question, they become the ghost and have to chase the other children. What should be apparent from these descriptions is that singing and dancing and music making of all kinds are woven into the patterns of activity of the community. They provide a rhythm to daily life, and we see among the Yupik, as among many other hunter-gatherers, that the gestures performed by dancers are often very similar to the kinds of gestures they perform in their daily activities. Sledding motions or harpooning for men, and gestures associated with the processing of animal carcasses or food gathering for women. The boundary between musical behaviors and other activities is not rigidly defined in the way that we are more used to. It's part of the fabric that binds the community and gives meaning and form to all aspects of life. Music is also a way of interacting with and influencing the surrounding world, and shamans use music as a means of facilitating communications with other, unseen worlds. Singing and drumming was used by Yupik shamans to enter a state in which their soul would leave their body and commune with the hunting gods. Hunters also used music to influence the ever-shifting world around them, even using ritual song during the hunt itself, as we saw with the Blackfoot. And among the Blackfoot, historically the use of ritual and ceremonial music to influence the surrounding environment has been so extensive and detailed that it's hard to properly give a description here. It could almost be its own series, honestly. But if you want an idea of how highly developed it is, just take this brief quote, again by Morley, relating to just one such ritual. In a ceremony to influence the weather, he says, a bundle of objects is opened and the correct song must be sung for each in the right order to activate each object. Some of these ceremonial bundles can contain over 160 items. Just imagine what that would entail. Now, the centrality of the community in the lives of hunter-gatherers, coupled with music's function as a bridge to communicate with other worlds, also leads to a very interesting conception of the way in which music relates to humans. Our modern understanding of where music comes from is deeply influenced by the crystallization of the modern idea of the genius during the Romantic era. The idea of the lone individual who, in something almost akin to isolation, produces from within him or herself some great flowering of knowledge and beauty, which is the product of some interior spark. In other words, music comes from within. It is an expression of something that is inside us. And in truth, this is how we conceive of our thoughts and our actions and feelings and desires in general, as if these are something that come from within us, as if they are ours, which is a slightly paradoxical position to hold when we live in a world that confronts us with continuous evidence of how easily our behaviours and thoughts and desires can be influenced by marketing and social media, where we can see through things like branding and even meme culture that most of what humans do is the simple and sometimes even beautiful repeating of patterns that they have observed in the world around them. We absorb a continuous stream of patterns, both consciously and unconsciously. And as far as where our thoughts come from, well, if we really examine the incessant flow of our thoughts, we have to admit that we have little control over it. They simply emerge into our consciousness. They pop into our minds from some unfathomable place that we cannot see into. I once read, and can't remember where, an interesting way of putting this. Your inner monologue is nothing but the interminable babble of all the thousands upon thousands of people and ideas that you have encountered in your life, all contradicting one another and all happening at once. You might remember an example that we mentioned a couple of episodes ago. You walk into a store and the radio is playing a song that you really know you can't stand. You know it. Every time you hear this song, you think to yourself how much you don't like it. And then 5 minutes later, you're walking down the street and what happens? You catch yourself happily humming that very same tune to yourself, and you weren't even aware you were doing it. So to say that our actions and thoughts and intuitions come from the outside is just as reasonable as saying that they come from the inside. And this idea of the mental world being permeable, in some sense continuous with the outside world, is a little closer to the understanding of music among many hunter-gatherers, along with other things that we take to be ours, like dreams or desires. In a sense, we could say that they have a bit of a more honest understanding of how they relate to these things. If we truly do not know where these things come from, certainly not from the conscious I that we think of when we think of ourselves, then their response is simply to not assume ownership of them. Central to the understanding of music among many hunter-gatherers is the idea of possession. When you live in a space where the boundary between the visible and the invisible world is very porous, life is everywhere. All things contain spirits, and spirits can and do inhabit everything at various times. Among some peoples, music itself is possessed by spirits, hence its power. In such a world where boundaries blur in this way, you might be going about your daily life and could suddenly be possessed by an unknown spirit, which might be benevolent, a sudden inspiration or a realization, or the ability to perform a great deed of daring, or it could be malignant, an illness or some sudden unexplained or disturbing behavior. And even we still say similar things in those moments when we admit how little conscious control we have over our mental sphere. We don't even need to think of examples of mental illness which are often brought up when talking about possession. We just need to think about a time in the past when we foolishly reacted to something in a sudden flash of anger. We all know how that felt afterwards, and we probably said something like, "I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from, I don't know what came over me." Now that's possession talk, right there. We understand the mechanism very differently, chemicals and neurons firing in the brain, but we are describing similar concerns. And the understanding of possession can work as a mechanism for alleviating some of the societal and individual ills that come from these behaviors. And in fact, It may even work better than what is achieved by our use of drugs and therapies in terms of reintegrating, in terms of bringing individuals back into the fold of the community following such an episode. Now, getting back to music, for the Blackfoot, music was traditionally told to them in dreams. So there would be nothing that resembles our idea of a composer, or even stranger, of an intellectual property or ownership of a song. That said, an individual might still be widely celebrated as the recipient of such an inspiration. The Aka and Mbuti Pygmies share a similar understanding. For them, it is their ancestors, whom they commune with in their dreams, who teach them songs. Not only showing this idea of an external source for music, but also emphasizing the idea of music being something that is shared within the community, that is learned from elders and others within the group, and that the transmission of songs from one generation to the next is a fundamental aspect in preserving cultural continuity. Since music is not perceived as belonging to anyone, and there isn't a conception that parallels our idea of a composer, music is also not composed in the way that we often think of it. It is not so much prescribed by a composer who writes down a detailed musical score. Instead, the pattern emerges from the interactions and the gestures of those who take part. So the pieces are not intended to be great displays of compositional virtuosity, and yet, with these hunter-gatherer songs, despite what might sometimes appear on the surface as quite simple structures, there is a rich complexity to many of these performances that emerges out of the very interactions of these gestures. There are continuous shifts and drifts and alterations within the patterns that introduce a kind of complexity that mean that many of these songs cannot be properly written down in conventional Western notation, especially not in a way that adequately represents how they are thinking of the music when they perform it. If you listen carefully, in this recording you can even hear the sound produced by insects in the forest, forming its own separate but also interwoven rhythm. Another thing you may have noticed is that unlike the other musics we have talked about so far, which are predominantly monophonic, Aka and Mbuti music abounds in polyphony, illustrating how despite certain underlying similarities, there is also great variation in the styles of music between hunter-gatherer cultures. The case of the Aka and the Mbuti is particularly of interest when talking about the place of music within the spiritual life of the community, because they believe, as do a number of other cultures in Africa, that sound is the primary and sometimes only means of communication with other worlds, with the spirit and the divine. For this reason, their singing is largely made up of vocables, those purely expressive, non-semantic utterances. What lyrics there are often consist of a single repeated line, expressing in what we might call divine simplicity the depth of their connection to the forest. Examples such as "the forest is good" among the Aka, and "we are the children of the forest," or "darkness is good," recorded among the Mbuti. The centrality of sound to their lives is not an accident. In the darkness of the forest, much of the surrounding world is invisible, especially at night, but it can always be heard. We live in a highly visual culture, brightly lit and dominated by an infinite variety of visual media, so it is easy to forget that for pre-modern humans, the world would often have been more audible than visible, and not just at night. In the next episode, we will see instances of chambers discovered within caves which have been found to have very interesting acoustical properties. And in these we find evidence of what are likely human behaviours that were intended to be heard more than seen. As was highlighted by Philip Peake in a paper on the role of sound in cross-world communication, we have spent a lot of time studying visual representations of otherworld beings, of spirits, ancestors and gods in our ethnographic studies of traditional cultures. But very little has been done to try to understand the acoustic aspect of cross-world communication, how the invisible world manifests in sound and in silence. And yet it is precisely these oral manifestations that seem to have the deepest connections to other worlds. The world of matter that we observe with our eyes is bounded in space. Things have defined shapes and sizes and boundaries. Sound, the world that we encounter through our ears, is boundless. It moves freely. Our world is bathed in it and traversed by it. In cultures where it is understood that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is not rigidly defined, sound permeates between worlds, and the flow goes in both directions. It's not just the sounds that are produced on which careful attention is placed. It's not just that the sounds that are used to summon or to communicate with otherworld beings should be of the right kind. Special skill is also required in hearing and interpreting sounds that come from the other world. So hearing in these practices is as important as sound making, as speech or music. The spiritual world is always present in the lives of hunter-gatherers, breathed into every aspect of the landscape. In simplest terms, we could say that matter is what the world is made of, what occupies space. And spirit is that which moves things, that transforms and guides and directs all things. Spirit is that which gives life, and that which moves and changes and transforms has life. So all things, from people to plants to rivers to mountains, are alive with spirits. If we wanted to take this into the realm of philosophy, we would say that in this perspective, matter has more of the nature of space, and spirit has more of the nature of time. And sound, though it moves freely through space, is ephemeral. Its nature is deeply tied to that of time. It exists in the moment and then vanishes. It is ever-changing, and it cannot be frozen in time, even for a moment. Without movement, there is no sound. And so sound, this invisible, intangible movement, which is nonetheless undeniably very much there, is by its nature most similar to spirit. For this reason, in animistic and shamanistic cultures, the religious specialists are, among other things, masters of sound. As Anthony Jackson noted in Sound and Ritual, a deaf ritual specialist is an anomaly, whereas a blind one is common enough. These sound specialists are able to communicate with other worlds and also to relate the speech of spirits, either through their voice or through the use of sound producers and musical instruments. The sounds and the voices of other worlds are marked by their strangeness, by nasalizing the voice, lisping, howling, retching, rasping sounds, scraping sounds, buzzing, droning. And we see elements of all these still preserved even in the musics of settled modern peoples who conserve elements of animistic belief in their cultural practices. It has been noticed by numerous musicologists that an interesting characteristic found among many Central African musical traditions, both among settled agriculturalists and the few remaining hunter-gatherers, is the way in which the clarity of musical tones is in many instances intentionally interfered with through the application of membranes and other attachments that cause the instrument to buzz when played. In a cross-cultural survey of African musics, Edward Liefschitz noted that this augmentation of sound with a secondary buzzing noise is an ancient traditional practice associated with the voices of ancestors. Sound masking of this kind is a deep feature of many traditional musics around the world that deal with other worlds. Often, in masquerades where spirit beings are presented as figures wearing masks, it is not uncommon for the voice to also be masked, sometimes through the use of membranes that rattle the voice, not unlike what we might be familiar with in a kazoo, other times through other kinds of vocal resonators. The most common form of masking in spirit speech the world over is naturally the use of vocables, again those non-semantic expressive utterances. We even see distant echoes of this in Western culture in the so-called practice of speaking in tongues, also known as glossolalia. And thinking about it, it's probably not surprising that such a practice has experienced something of a revival, specifically among certain Christian groups in the southern United States, where the culture of the southern United States is very deeply influenced by aspects of those Central African animist cultures that were forcibly brought over along with slaves, and it's often influenced by these aspects without even necessarily being aware of it. Now let's pause for a moment on that buzzing sound that we just mentioned that is characteristic of certain African musics. In the West, these kinds of quote-unquote extraneous noises are traditionally precisely the kinds of sounds that composers and instrument makers sought to eliminate from music for hundreds of years. Much of the Western sacred and classical tradition can be understood as an attempt to achieve a certain kind of sonic clarity. The development of sophisticated instruments such as pianos and clarinets or violins, not to mention the traditions of singing in religious choral music and in opera, are all attempts to produce sounds that are in a sense pure tones, from which all noise, as much as physically possible, has been removed. The mechanisms of pianos and other instruments are built to be as silent as possible, and when it comes to the human voice, in the past some even went as far as castrating young boys in order to achieve an angelic-like clarity of tone. Growing up in the West, we kind of take this idea of musical sounds being radically separated from noises as something of a given. This idea of clear, atomized, distinguishable tones, what we call notes, the building blocks of music. We even use musical note emojis as a way of representing the idea of music itself. Now, we won't be getting into this here, because we'll have time to talk about this much later on in the series. But it is worth pointing out that this way of thinking of music as pure tones, as notes that have been unambiguously separated from noise, almost like perfect geometric points, is in no small part the result of the way in which key ideas in theology and Neoplatonic philosophy influenced the Western tradition as a whole, and the development of its sacred and classical music in particular. So, in many ways it's more of a cultural and historical happenstance. And when we look the world over, we find an almost infinite variety of musical traditions whose musical concerns are in many cases clearly very different. From the didgeridoos of Aboriginal music to the many throat-singing traditions of the world to the buzzing tones which many African musicians go out of their way to make their instruments produce. What is really important to take away from this is that these buzzing, rasping, scraping, droning sounds, and the yelps and the howls and whistles that imitate the calls of animals, as well as all the sounds of the natural world and all other manner of sounds that we could not imagine to adequately represent with a musical note. All of these are very natural and pervasive features of musicking, and they have been for at least tens of thousands of years. If they are often not discussed in treatments of music theory and music history, it is only because the way in which the study of music has evolved in the West does not have the language to adequately talk about such things. In the West, the piano as an instrument is almost a symbol of music itself, and there are a number of very understandable cultural reasons as to why the piano has assumed such a central role. But how long has the piano been around? A couple of 100 years? 250 if we want to include those precursors to the modern piano that were used by Mozart and Haydn. So that's not really very long, is it? Let's take as a comparison the bull roarer that we mentioned in the last episode, the voice that eats everything. The bull roarer is an instrument that has been around since prehistory, and which has been used across all inhabited continents for the summoning of deep acoustical forces, through which countless generations have spoken with other worlds, and through which they have heard the voices of unseen beings. Still today, among the funerary practices of the Yoruba, who are very far from being hunter-gatherers, but who have managed to preserve certain aspects of ancient animistic practices even in the modern world. Among their funerary ceremonies, we find a practice described as opening the voice of the deceased, which is performed with bull roarers, in which the voice of the new ancestor is heard for the first time. Now, if we were to consider instances such as this as our archetypal images of music, rather than, say, a piano concerto, how different would our understanding of music be? Now, before we conclude today, I would like to take a moment to also look at the musical instruments themselves and see what the musical instruments of hunter-gatherers might tell us about what evidence of musical practices we might expect to find amongst ancient humans. As we saw, hunter-gatherer music consists predominantly of vocal music with the accompaniment of percussion instruments, and this highlights the first challenge that we face when we examine prehistoric human remains in search for evidence of musical behaviours. It is likely that the first musical instruments were the human voice and the hitting of objects and of hands and the stomping of feet, all of which do not leave any evidence that allows us to pinpoint the first emergence of musical behaviours. So it is likely that a variety of proto-musical behaviours that we might consider to be in some way musical, even if our ancestors may not have thought of them in that way, might have been taking place very far back in our evolutionary past, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But in the absence of concrete evidence, we can only speculate on this. Hunter-gatherer societies often tend to have a generally egalitarian structure, where individuals distinguish themselves for their skill in particular areas, so the making of instruments is sometimes a communal affair, even involving children, but in cases of populations such as the Yupik, each village or group might also have a specialist instrument maker. The processes by which many instruments are made also reveal another close connection to the natural world. Western musical instruments are machines, in the sense in which technology defines itself as different from natural processes. But in the making of instruments among hunter-gatherers, the patterns of the natural world are intrinsic to the making or obtaining of many instruments. The most famous example is likely the didgeridoo, a branch, or more often the trunk, of a eucalyptus tree which has been hollowed out by termites. A suitably infested tree is found thanks to the indigenous Australians' knowledge of the landscape and of the patterns of termite activity. Knocking on the tree trunk will often then serve to confirm its hollowness, variations in the sound indicating varying degrees of hollowness. This knocking practice illustrates again how hunter-gatherers have to become experts at listening for acoustic cues in order to perform the tasks that are central to their lives. Another example of a musical instrument that is shaped by natural forces is the dried gourd, a pumpkin-like fruit. When the gourd dries out, detached seeds and other detritus caught inside will rattle around when it's shaken. Little stones or seeds are also intentionally placed in a gourd for this purpose. Dried nutshells can be strung together in a bracelet to make a rattle, as can suspended deer hooves tied to a stick, or smaller bones placed inside a tortoise shell. In fact, almost anything can be used to make a rattle. Tree bark, seashells, or even spiders' nests, as observed among the Plains Indians. As you've likely already noticed, these materials are all extremely perishable. What chance would an instrument made of spider's nest have of being even partially preserved for tens of thousands of years, and then of being stumbled upon by modern humans, and then of being correctly identified and interpreted by researchers? Some instruments can be a little easier to identify. Drums can leave telltale signs, especially if they're in the form of an animal skin stretched over a hollow log or some other similar frame. But much drumming among hunter-gatherers is also produced by beating on trees or logs or rocks or the human body. Whistles, and most of all, flutes, can be some of the easiest to identify as being intentionally produced by humans for musical or music-like behaviours. But these only represent a small part of the instruments that we observe across hunter-gatherer cultures. And even here, as we will see in the next episode, things are not quite as straightforward as they might appear. I'd say that's a good place to stop for today. I always end up making these way longer than I intended, but hopefully you can see that you really can't understand a people's music separate from the rest of their culture and of their history. As always, you can find links in the description below to resources for all the things that we've been talking about today. What I've tried to do with the musics that I've played throughout this episode is to give a flavour of some of the sounds and the musics, but by no means all. I've also included some recordings of neighbouring peoples to the ones that we've talked about. For example, when talking about the Aka, who you might also, by the way, hear called Baka or Bayaka. When talking about their musics, I also included some musics by the neighbouring Baka people. And yes, the Aka are also called Ba'aka or Bayaka, and the Baka, on the other hand, are a separate people. Separate but somewhat interrelated through cultural exchange, especially in the last few centuries, and I'm sure we'll get into that when we talk about these cultures more in depth at some point down the line. Now, another reason why I've also had to cast my net quite wide when choosing sounds for this episode is because I have to be careful about copyright, which is somewhat ironic in the circumstances. I mean, the idea that companies hold copyrights on recordings of hunter-gatherer musicking is, well, I mean, it's bullshit, frankly, but those are also things that I have to be aware of when making these episodes, especially as what little revenue is being generated by these intellectual properties is not finding its way to the few remaining pockets of these populations. Now, on the other hand, I'm also very lucky because there are other people more after my own heart whose recordings and materials are freely available. One person who I feel particularly indebted towards is Felix Blumer, or at least I think that's how he would pronounce his name. Now, I've used a number of his recordings throughout these episodes. In this episode, I have a recording that he made in Mali of Le Jeune Fille de Diafrabé, who are a girl singing group native to Mali. Another recording of his that I used back in episode 3, the one on Musi language, is the one of the woman griot in Mali again, which is an absolutely stunning recording. And that one's a perfect example. You can see in this one not only the quality of the recordings that he makes, but also the very interesting choices in terms of subject matter. I mean, it's amazing. Similarly, my materials are available to be shared in the description of each video. There's also a link to download an audio-only version of that episode, just an MP3 file, if you want to have it to listen or to share, whatever. Recently, I was contacted by someone who tells me they're interested in starting a course, in part based on some of the materials and the things that I've talked about in these episodes, which obviously I'm somewhat daunted and flattered by, but I think it's really cool if it is starting some sort of discussion around some of these topics that are often not discussed when talking about music. So for any of you who are along for this ride with me, that's awesome, and thank you. Oh, and one last thing that might be worth linking in the description below is the choral piece that I played when talking about Western music instead. That's a recording of a performance by the Dunedin consort performing Qui consolabatur me by Jacobus Clemens non Papa. And that recording is genuinely one of my all-time favourite recordings of choral music, so I'll link to that one below as well. Jacobus Clemens non Papa is known by this very strange name these days because there used to also be a pope who was called Jacobus Clemens, and so I forget who it was now, but in one of his collections of compositions at the time, somebody styled the name as Jacobus Clemens non Papa. Basically, Jacobus Clemens, not the Pope, which obviously was a bit of a joke because even at the time, it's not like anybody would have thought, oh, this is written by the Pope. But it's a kind of in-joke that sort of stuck, and still today people call him Jacobus Clemens non Papa. But anyway, links to that in the description as well, links to everything, so knock yourselves out with those until the next episode, and I'll see you then.